Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the medieval period, but not the parts you see in movies. We're talking about the awkward, unglamorous, and deeply weird aspects of daily life that were so normal back then, nobody bothered writing them down. Which is honestly rude of them, because these details are fascinating. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Constant migration. The medieval world kept moving. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves about medieval people is that they stayed put. Born in one village, died in the same bed, never leaving the comforting radius of the local cow. In reality, medieval life was less rooted farming community and more permanent state of low-energy relocation. People moved constantly, usually not because they wanted to, but because something had gone horribly wrong. Crops failed, lords raised rents, armies marched through, ate everything, and left behind the medieval equivalent of a "sorry about that" note written in hoofprints. When this happened, peasants didn't complain. Complaining was dangerous. They packed, and by packed, I mean they grabbed whatever wasn't nailed down, argued over whether the cooking pot was worth carrying, and walked toward maybe this place is slightly less cursed. Seasonal work added to the chaos. Harvest time pulled laborers across entire regions. Religious festivals triggered mass human migration as thousands of people decided that walking for weeks to stand in a field and pray was a perfectly reasonable vacation plan. Pilgrimages were popular because nothing says spiritual growth like blistered feet and food poisoning. Travel itself was an experience. Roads were mud. Mud was everywhere. In winter you sank. In summer you choked on dust. Signposts were rare. Maps were optimistic lies. Getting lost wasn't an accident. It was the default setting. And yet people kept going, because staying could be worse. Villages became revolving doors of humanity. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. Nobody asked too many questions because tomorrow, they might be the ones leaving under cover of darkness with a sack of grain and a growing sense of regret. Outsourced romance. Medieval love letters. Romance in the medieval world was heartfelt, emotional, and frequently outsourced. Because while people were deeply capable of falling in love, most of them were not capable of writing it down. Literacy was rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for clergy, nobles, and that one guy in town who wouldn't stop correcting everyone. So when medieval people wanted to express affection, devotion, or uncontrollable longing, they hired a professional, a scribe, a clerk, sometimes a monk. Nothing kills the mood like whispering your deepest feelings to a man who has sworn celibacy and is judging your grammar. Picture the scene. You enter a small room that smells like ink, parchment, and quiet disappointment. You clear your throat and say, "I need a letter, a love letter." The scribe nods calmly, dips his quill, and asks, "How intense are we talking?" Then comes the confession. You dictate your feelings out loud, slowly, carefully, while another human being writes down every word with the emotional distance of someone taking grocery notes. You say, "Tell her my heart burns for her." The scribe pauses, looks up, and asks, "Burns as in spiritually, or burns as in alarming?" Medieval love letters followed formal structures. There were opening praises, emotional declarations, vows of loyalty, and dramatic flourishes borrowed from classical texts. If you weren't eloquent enough, the scribe would help. Would you like to compare her beauty to the dawn, the rose, or divine light? This was not optional. Romance had formatting rules. And even better, the scribe often knew both parties. Small towns didn't offer anonymity. Your love letter might be written by someone who baptized your crush, taught her cousin to read, and absolutely knew she was already engaged. Professional discretion was encouraged. Professional silence was hopeful. Yet somehow, despite all this, medieval love letters worked. People married, affairs happened, hearts were broken. Love survived quills, witnesses,
reused metaphors, and monks with opinions. Romance wasn't private. It wasn't discreet, but it was sincere, even when dictated. Left-handed suspicion, the sinister problem. In medieval society, being left-handed wasn't a harmless quirk. It was a red flag, a warning sign, a gentle suggestion from the universe that something about you was off. And by off, medieval people meant possibly cursed, morally suspicious, or one bad day away from witchcraft.
The problem started with symbolism. The Latin word for left is sinister, which should tell you everything you need to know. Right-handedness was associated with order, righteousness, and divine favor. Left-handedness was linked to chaos, deception, and doing things the wrong way, literally. If you reached for something with your left hand, someone nearby probably frowned and quietly reconsidered trusting you. Left-handed children were often corrected early, and by corrected, I mean actively trained out of it. Teachers, parents, and religious figures encouraged right-hand use for writing, eating, praying, and basically existing. If you stubbornly favored your left hand, it wasn't seen as preference. It was seen as defiance, or worse, influence. Even daily rituals reinforced this bias. People crossed themselves with their right hand. Oaths were sworn with the right hand raised. Important actions happened on the right side. Doing something left-handed felt wrong in a way that was both social and spiritual. Despite all this, left-handed people persisted. They worked, fought, wrote, cooked, and survived quietly using the hand that felt natural. Many simply learned to switch in public and revert in private, a medieval version of code switching, but for hands. Living without mirrors, medieval self-awareness. In the medieval world, self-awareness existed. Self-reflection did not, at least not visually. Because for most people, mirrors were rare, expensive, and wildly impractical. Which means the average medieval peasant went through life with only a vague, second-hand understanding of what their own face looked like. Glass mirrors were luxury items owned by nobles, monasteries, or that one suspiciously wealthy merchant who never explained where his money came from. Polished metal mirrors existed, but they were small, dull, distorted, and often showed you a version of yourself that looked like it had been lightly cursed. For most people, the closest thing to a mirror was water. Ponds, wells, buckets, or rivers offered fleeting glimpses, usually warped by ripples, shadows, or the sudden realization that you might fall in and die. You didn't linger, you glanced, accepted whatever vague shape stared back, and moved on. As a result, medieval people learned what they looked like through descriptions. Other people told them, not kindly, "You have your father's nose. Your eyes are too close together. You look tired." This was your mirror. Social feedback, brutal, unfiltered, and unavoidable. This also meant personal grooming was approximate. Hairstyles were practical, not aesthetic. Beards were trimmed based on feel, not appearance. If your hair looked uneven, someone would eventually mention it loudly, publicly, and with unnecessary enthusiasm. The idea of checking your appearance before leaving the house simply didn't exist. You left the house and hoped for the best. If no one laughed immediately, you assumed things were fine. Confidence was easier when you had no visual proof otherwise. Named possessions, medieval object relationships. One of the strangest facts about medieval life is how emotionally attached people were to their stuff. Not in a modern consumerist way. There was no impulse buying, no seasonal upgrades. When you owned something in the Middle Ages, it was because you needed it. And chances were, you would own it for most of your life. Naturally, people started giving these objects names. Tools were the most common candidates. A shovel wasn't just a shovel, it was the shovel. The one that helped you survive winters, dig fields, bury relatives, and occasionally threaten geese. When something does that much emotional labor, it earns a name. Axes, plows, knives, and even cooking pots were often referred to as if they were co-workers rather than property. Weapons were especially personal. Swords, daggers, and shields frequently had names, sometimes serious, sometimes oddly affectionate. A blade that had protected you in battle wasn't metal, it was a companion. Breaking it wasn't inconvenient, it was tragic. But it didn't stop there. Ovens were named, doors were named, bells were named. If an object was central to daily survival, it crossed the line from tool to personality. An oven that baked good bread was praised. One that failed was insulted, loudly, repeatedly in front of others. This wasn't superstition. It was practicality mixed with exhaustion. When your entire life depended on a handful of objects functioning properly, you developed relationships with them. You spoke to them. You blamed them. You thanked them. Named objects appeared in wills. I leave my good knife to my eldest son. Not just any knife, the good one. Everyone knew which one that meant. Objects carried memory, reputation, and history. Losing them was losing a piece of identity. The terror of being forgotten. One quiet fear haunted medieval life more than war, famine, or even disease: being forgotten. Not dying. Dying was expected. Being erased, that was unbearable. In a world with no photographs, no recordings, and very little written documentation, memory was fragile. If no one remembered you, it was as if you had never existed. This is why people obsessed over names. Children were named after parents, grandparents, saints, and occasionally that one uncle everyone agreed deserved another shot. Naming wasn't creative, it was archival. You weren't honoring someone, you were keeping them alive through repetition. Gravestones, when they existed, mattered enormously. Even the simplest marker, a carved symbol, a scratched name, a rough cross, was a declaration. I was here. I mattered enough to be remembered. If you couldn't afford stone, memory had to do the work instead. Stories became tombstones you carried in your head. This fear also explains why medieval people loved witnesses. Contracts were spoken aloud. Promises were made in groups. Events were public. If enough people saw something happen, it became real. If no one saw it, it might as well have never happened. Church records existed partly for the same reason. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, all carefully logged, not just for God, but for memory. Being written down meant permanence. Being unwritten meant vanishing quietly into the mud of history. The fear of silence. In the modern world, silence is marketed as luxury. Medieval people heard silence and immediately assumed something had gone terribly, spiritually wrong. A silent medieval house was not peaceful, it was suspicious. Noise meant life. Talking, coughing, praying, animals shuffling, tools clanking. These were reassuring sounds. If a home went quiet, it suggested illness, death, or the presence of something that preferred you not notice it. And medieval people were very uncomfortable with things that preferred not to be noticed. This fear had religious roots. Silence was associated with the grave, the afterlife, and the unknown. Churches echoed on purpose, filling space with chanting, bells, and prayer. Bells rang constantly for timekeeping, warnings, celebrations, funerals, emergencies, and sometimes just because someone thought the silence was getting ideas. People talked while they worked, sang while they cooked, prayed out loud. Even alone, many people muttered to themselves, not because they were strange, but because being audibly present felt safer. Silence implied abandonment. Sound implied protection. At night, silence was especially dangerous. Darkness already belonged to spirits, demons, and theological anxiety. Add silence, and you had a perfect environment for imagining footsteps, whispers, or divine judgment creeping up behind you. Medieval life was absurd, not tragic.
It's easy to imagine medieval life as an endless parade of suffering, dirt, disease, danger, and despair stacked neatly on top of one another. And yes, life was hard, painfully hard. But what often gets lost is that medieval people weren't walking around in constant despair. Most days were ordinary, and ordinary medieval life was quietly absurd. People laughed, they joked, they gossiped, they complained about neighbors, weather, prices, and authority enthusiastically. Medieval humor was blunt, crude, and extremely unfiltered. Festivals existed everywhere: saints' days, feast days, market days. Any excuse to stop working, eat too much, drink something questionable, and forget responsibilities was embraced. People danced badly. They sang loudly. They mocked authority figures with jokes just subtle enough to avoid punishment. Even hardship had routine. Famine wasn't a constant emergency. It was something people planned around. Illness was frightening, but familiar. Death was present, but not paralyzing. When everything is dangerous, you adapt emotionally or you don't survive. Absurdity became a coping mechanism. Naming tools, believing sneezes were dangerous, avoiding unlucky days, arguing with ovens, assigning personalities to objects. None of this meant medieval people were foolish. It meant they were human in a world that offered very little certainty. History remembers wars and plagues, but medieval people remembered themselves through laughter, ritual, and resilience. And that's the part nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the myth.